Hello, my name is Sheila Meggers, and this is my presentation on cell phones in the educational setting. The First and Fourth Amendments relate to students' and schools' rights concerning cell phones at school. The First Amendment directly impacts how much public schools can control student expression and conduct. The Fourth Amendment restricts the extent to which schools may investigate violations of school policy. According to the Fourth Amendment, searches and seizures must be reasonable. These are the guidelines concerning cell phones that were given in a Teacher's Pocket Guide to School Law. The first one states that the use of cell phones should not be banned without sufficient evidence that they are disruptive. There should also be clear guidelines in place to regulate their use. The third one states that exceptions to the cell phone policy should be granted for medical or other special circumstances. And the one that policymakers should always keep in mind is that policies should be driven by a sense of fairness and consideration for the unique needs of students. When conflicts have arisen involving cell phones, these were some of the basic principles that came into play. As I looked at court cases, these were the basis for most of the rulings. First of all, schools do have the authority to implement policies to keep their schools safe, and this includes cell phones. Cell phones can be limited or confiscated if they disrupt the learning process. Since the fundamental purpose of school is student learning, the school must ensure that the learning environment is conducive to learning at all times. Third, the school faculty may search a cell phone if there is reasonable suspicion that a student has or is planning to violate school rules, the law, or cause someone else harm. And finally, when searching a phone, the school must use methods that are reasonable and not excessively intrusive. For example, it is acceptable to check a phone to determine its owner. However, it is not acceptable to text other students with it. There are relatively few court cases involving electronic communication devices. There seem to be two main issues that are involved with these cases. The first issue is whether the school can ban the possession of cell phones at school. In Price versus the New York City Board of Education, a group of 8 parents believed that their children should be allowed to bring phones to use in case of emergencies, such as 9/11. In all 3 of the cases I've listed, the courts ruled in favor of school policies that prohibited or banned phones at school. They determined that there was a rational basis for such a policy and that no constitutional rights of students were violated. The other issue that has appeared involving students and cell phones is the search process and exactly what is appropriate. The courts base their decisions on 2 things. First, the search has to be justified in its inception. Basically, if a student's phone is confiscated for violating a school policy, a search at that point can be justified. Second, the search has to be permissible in its scope. This varies from case to case and is harder to determine. In Miller v. Schumanic, several students' phones were confiscated and nude photographs of girls were discovered. In this case, the search was valid because they were searched immediately after students broke a policy and had their phones taken. In Clump v. Nazareth, the court agreed the seizure and search of the phone directory and call log was valid. However, when the school official pretended to be the student and sent text messages and then called 9 other students from that phone, the search went too far. In G.C. v. Owensboro, a freshman indicated that he was suicidal, and a school official searched his phone to determine if he had any plans to harm himself. This was permissible. However, when his phone was confiscated a year later for simply texting during class, an administrator searched the phone again just to see if he was planning to harm himself. This search was not determined to be reasonable in its scope. There are debates all over the internet, within the school, and in the community concerning cell phones at school. There are 2 very different perspectives on this. Those that are in favor tend to be parents who would like to be able to contact their child at all times. They feel they should have control over their child's phone use. They want to make sure their child is where he or she is supposed to be and use GPS to monitor this. Phones are also helpful for scheduling rides or other activities after school. And one of the main reasons for phones was for safety. In case of an emergency or school crisis, parents want their child to be able to call for help. Here are some of the arguments of those who oppose cell phones at school. School officials view cell phones as a nuisance. They are distracting to students during class. They aid with cheating. Students either text answers or take photos of the exam with their phones on their cameras. Inappropriate pictures of peers in restrooms or lockers are a concern. In some schools, they reported that organizing gang activities has increased through cell phone usage. Phones can get lost or stolen. They can also be used for cyberbullying, harassing, and sexting. And in a crisis, law enforcement has stressed that rampant cell phone use can overload communication systems and stop important calls that need to be going in and out. Here is the USD 308 policy concerning cell phones and electronic devices. The first bullet states that they are not allowed during school hours. However, the second bullet allows them during passing periods, lunch, and before and after school. There's a little bit of an inconsistency here. This year, when school started, it was verbally announced that cell phones are now permitted in classroom at the teacher's discretion. Our policy needs to be updated. There are not very clearly outlined consequences present, nor does our policy allow exceptions for students with medical conditions or other circumstances. I've also noticed that we are not consistent between buildings in our district. At the elementary level, phones are to be turned off as they enter, left in a backpack all day, and may only be turned on once they exit the building after school. At the middle school level, they are limited to before and after school and at lunch. As I said earlier, it is entirely up to each teacher at the high school. This causes a great deal of inconsistency as students go from hour to hour. Another area of concern is that students are always using their phones for texting, Facebook, and games during class time. Cell phones are a continuous distraction, and every teacher and administrator I visited with reiterated this. I've included this policy that I found from another school district. What I liked about it is that the guidelines for when cell phones could be used were very clear. It also stated where cell phones were to be turned off and not visible under any circumstances. It didn't leave any doubt in my mind as to what was expected. I also liked that it gave clearly outlined consequences for the first, second, and third offenses. I'm sure the system doesn't always work flawlessly, but I liked the clearly stated expectations and consequences for students, staff, and administrators to follow. Here are some statistics on teens and cell phones. The first graph shows that 97% of students own a cell phone. So cell phone use at school is a topic that includes nearly all teenage students. The second graph reflected the 3 levels of restrictions on cell phones that I came across in school policies. Some schools completely ban phones from even coming to school. Some just restrict their use to non-class time, and others allow them during class for educational purposes. What I found interesting in this chart is how close the percentages for having a phone on, calling, or texting during class were. The biggest benefit to cell phones in the classroom is when they are used for educational purposes. These were uses that I came across within my building as I questioned teachers. Some teachers were using them for research, some were assigning short quizzes, some were using them to survey a class or take a poll of some sort, some were using them as calculators. I've actually used the QR codes in my math classes. The students can use their phones to check their answer before moving on to the next station. They were highly engaged and highly motivated to get the correct answer. It was really a fun experience for me and the students. And I also came across a teacher who sends out a text blast to his students with a challenge question as soon as they come in the door. In conclusion, I think the inevitable conclusion here is that cell phones are here to stay. 47% of teens can text with their eyes closed. They are more adept than most adults at using cell phones for many purposes. Since cell phones at school are an ongoing concern, I do think it's important to have a policy that clearly states what is expected with consequences for not following the policy. Many educators are starting to embrace cell phones for educational purposes. I think in the ideal classroom, cell phones would not be seen as such a distraction, but would just fade into the background as they are simply being used as another educational tool. Thank you.